the talk that you gave for the nation, there was an interesting point brought up about how sports was utilized in order to accomplish a post-apartheid South Africa. And I thought that was so fascinating. I do want you to talk about that a little bit, but do so after we watch this lovely video featuring Ben Shapiro. He's a well-known conservative here in America who's upset that his safe space of sports has been infiltrated with politics. Let's take a quick look at that.
Now, Clay, it does make me wonder whether inevitably we're going to end up with basically two sports leagues. Whether at some point people are just going to want a sports league that does not allow this sort of stuff to impede the play or get on the field. And people are just going to view that, because I got to say, like, I've been fairly tolerant of this stuff in terms of watching sports my entire life. There are only a couple of times where I've really turned off the TV. One was, when it came to Sports Illustrated, I was a lifelong subscriber to Sports Illustrated. My parents gave it to me for my bar mitzvah. I had Sports Illustrated subscription for like another 10, 12 years. I used to keep the old issues in a box. I mean, that's how much I enjoyed it. And then when they decided, it's important for us to feature Caitlyn Jenner on the cover, when Bruce Jenner had not been an actual athlete for 3 decades. And all of a sudden I'm reading about transgenderism in Sports Illustrated. I was like, okay, I'm done. I can't do this anymore because this has nothing to do with sports. And I subscribe to a sports magazine. I'm not doing this anymore. And the other is during the Kaepernick protest, when it became incumbent on people to somehow approve of the hands up, don't shoot symbology that was being put out by particular players. I'm tempted to do the same with the NBA now that you have LeBron James, who was willing to basically virtue signal on behalf of the communist Chinese government, but rip Drew Brees. It's getting to the point where I don't want to watch sports. My place of comfort has been removed from me, and it may not be restored until there are actual sports leagues that remove politics from the sports.
So I couldn't help but think about that video after hearing what you shared with the audience in that talk with the nation, because there were boycotts toward South African rugby teams in order to make a point about how apartheid needed to end. I thought that was a really powerful point. Can you talk about that a little bit, and how both pop culture, sports, forms of entertainment have been used as a way to push forward with a political movement and message?
I mean, he sounds like a classic sort of like white South African saying that, sports, they used to actually say that sports and politics doesn't mix. That was sort of their, so that they could, keep playing rugby, keep playing cricket tests, while literally there's it's like an occupying state, right? Like with an occupying army. But yeah, they playing cricket and tennis and rugby and so on. So it's very familiar. Before I just want to talk about the South African experience, the one thing that I found fascinating, and I do unfortunately consume a lot of like the sports media. I actually want to say that the U.S. discussions around sports, like sports programming, outside of the stuff that's happening in the field of play, it's way more fun to watch. Like watching. So an example would be, one of my favorite sort of guilty pleasures is a show here on Fox Sports. This guy called Shannon Sharpe and Skip. I mean, it's not, I don't expect rocket science from it. But what I found fascinating in the last couple of weeks is like there was one moment when Shannon Sharpe, who I think played NFL football. I think he's a Hall of Famer. And at one moment he's like, well, Skip, as the great Oscar Romero said in El Salvador, and I was like, what? This is what I think is interesting about sport, like how sport here, sport is keeping. So there's the stuff in the street, and everybody else is talking about elections and electionism and so on. Except for the independent media, of course, but in the mainstream. But what I find interesting about the mainstream here is like how then sports media kind of keeps the conversation going, because there's stuff about statues or what a coach said. And so the same guy, Shannon Sharpe, said something the other day where he said about the NASCAR ban on the flags, right, at NASCAR events. And he said something like, well, I mean, in Germany, you need special permission to use a Nazi flag. And the flag is banned. Why are they doing it here? Why would they use a flag of something, try to defend a horrible regime and act like it was normal? So like you see that kind of debate in sports radio that I don't think you often, that sort of emphatic description of like what is wrong and in a very common sense way that you don't, I think, often see in the mainstream. But just quickly on the I think the lessons and the piece you referred to is about the attempt to, like, isolate Israel, right? So the key thing about the South African situation was sports mattered for white South African identity, because white South African identity tied its success to, so the reason for existing of that regime, and that regime need like a kind of soft power, and the soft power was it was very good at rugby and it was very good at cricket. I mean, it was also in some places it was also very good in certain individual sports. So like golf, the golfer Gary Player, right, who was like one of the greatest golfers of all time. And then there's, in tennis, they had some decent tennis players. I think one of them is like still a commentator on TV, this guy called Cliff Drysdale. So, they had decent tennis players in certain individual sports and some athletes. So it mattered to them that they do successfully in sport. And secondly, that they were deemed to be a member of the community of nations. And so it meant the fact of participation counted for the legitimacy of South Africa. And so what happened at the end of the 1960s, it actually started in the early 60s with Dennis Brutus, who had gone to prison with Nelson Mandela. He had been arrested, then he was in jail, and then I think he was released and he was going to be rearrested, and he fled the country. And he started this thing called the South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee. And then they worked very hard, actually culminating in 1968. I think he met with the African-American athletes who did the Black Power salute at the games in Mexico. And they eventually managed to convince FIFA to ban South African soccer, the tennis, etc. They went on to the US Open in Nashville. But just back to the point about rugby and cricket. So what happened is and Wimbledon also, from the end of the 1960s, the beginning of the 1970s, many of these people said, okay, you can do what Dennis is doing by going to the sports associations and appealing that South Africa should be banned, but you can also disrupt the games. Now, if you couldn't do it in South Africa, you have to disrupt South Africans when they play outside, because that's where they thought they were legitimate, that people accept them. So they would disrupt Wimbledon, they would disrupt cricket matches when South African teams would play in Australia and Britain. And so eventually it got to a point by the late, I would say the early 1980s, the only way that South Africa could get teams to come to South Africa, well, first, they were not going overseas anymore. And the only way they could do it was for teams to come to South Africa. And so they would pay players. They ended up playing, sadly, also players from the West Indies, but Australia, England, to come and play games against them. These teams were usually called rebels. But the point is, by at least the early to the mid-1980s, it was very clear that they had lost this battle because of sports sanctions, and that it did a lot for their morale of wanting to be part of the world. And again, it's sort of very selfish. Like apartheid should end so that we could play tennis again, so that we could play rugby again. And I think in that way, it undermined the morale of white South Africa for something that seemed very trivial, but very powerful. And I think it's the same year in this country where you could see this around Kaepernick, right? Where when Kaepernick first kneeled, I think it was in 2016, he was a pariah of some sort, mostly in sort of mainstream white media. Right now, they're falling over their feet to like praise him. And some of them invent histories for themselves, including some black commentators like this guy, Stephen A. Smith. They suddenly all like, oh, I love Kaepernick, etc. So that's why I think sports is interesting to watch. Let me make one other quick point, which I don't want a misrepresentation to happen. It's true that Americans don't often look to the rest of the world, and it's very insular. And as I said, there are exceptions. There's always been an internationalist movement here. But it would be remiss from me not to mention the 1980s and the movement to divest from South Africa on campuses, the attempt to push through Congress by particularly black Congress people, the original sort of like where some elements of the black Congressional Black Caucus comes from, Ron Dellums, like people like that who were very crucial in that movement. So as I said, our campus movements to make that stuff happen, the churches, just like pushing the American debate on reform which was called at that time under Reagan constructive engagement, and pushing for much more radical reforms. And my last point on that is that was also a period that coincided particularly in Black and radical sort of left politics in the US, which is very much like third world politics, solidarity politics. So that stuff might come back, when people draw on the lessons of stuff that they did before, that they didn't do well. I think some of that might come back. So I don't want to create the impression that because of the exceptionalism of the United States and of the way that exceptionalism becomes kind of broadly dispersed in how people in the US think about who they are and what's possible, it's not entirely true. There have been moments here where Americans have made those connections with the rest of the world, and in trying to imagine a different kind of world.
Absolutely. Well, one of the ways that people can concretely engage in those subjects and reading and thinking about them is by reading Africa as a Country, which I read regularly, and also by subscribing to the YouTube channel, Africa as a Country. I will say I'm going to plug this Tuesday. I'm having William Shaki on the Michael Brooks Show, and we're going to get into really in-depth conversation on South African policing and teasing out some of those global dimensions. And I'm sorry, one more plug, because he was on a couple of weeks ago, and of course he's one of my regular co-conspirators. Check out Wozni Lambre's Hoops Adjacent podcast with David Aldrich, and that's actually a great example of what Sean is talking about. I really think it's true that some of the sports coverage in the United States and sports culture conversations are just light years ahead of certainly corporate mainstream media. And I always enjoyed watching Cliff Drysdale as a commentator growing up watching tennis, I have to admit. But at any rate, Sean Jacobs, really appreciate your time, man. Everybody check out Africa as a Country website, subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's really great.
Thank you very much for having me.
Take care.
Okay, thank you.